Well, hopefully not. Hello there. Thank you for tuning in to Town Meeting TV's ongoing coverage of the 2024 election. This program is brought to you in a series of forums that we are producing in advance of the election on November 5th, which are supported by Town Meeting TV's generous underwriting crew. Thanks to those folks. You can find all of our forums online at cctv.org/general or on our Town Meeting TV YouTube channel where auto-generated captions are available. If you're tuning in on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel to stay tuned into local democracy this season. On today's program, we'll hear from folks from the Burlington Electric Department who have joined us to talk about the bond question on the ballot in November. So thank you both so much for joining us. Darren Springer, are you the general manager?
General manager.
General manager of BED, as well as Emily Stebbins-Wheelock, who is the chief financial officer of BED.
Thanks for having us, Bobby.
Thank you.
Great, awesome. So we've got some questions for you. You've got some slides to just kind of give us an overview of this $20 million bond that BED is asking voters to approve. If you're tuning in live, we also welcome your questions at 802-862-3966. You can call in and we'll do our best to prioritize your question and put you on the air here. So let's maybe get started with your overview of this bond item here, and there we go. There it is.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. We'll go ahead and kick it off.
Thanks, Darren. So voters in Burlington on November 5th will see ballot item number 1 on their ballot, which is a ballot question related to authorizing BED to issue up to $20 million of revenue bond debt. So we thought we would start with some basics, which is what is a revenue bond? How does this work? So a revenue bond is basically a form of borrowing where BED would borrow money by issuing bonds, investors would buy those bonds, and we would promise to pay those investors back a rate of return over a year, about usually 20 years is the life of the bonds. So the Burlington Electric Department has authorization to issue revenue bonds under the city charter, and there's also a general bond resolution. To issue revenue bonds, BED requires a vote of a majority of Burlington voters. All forms of debt issuance must be voter authorized. And revenue bonds are different than city general obligation bonds in that they're payable solely from electric department revenues. So this will not be a city general obligation. They will not be paid back by the property tax. It will not affect property taxes. The bond debt service will be paid only out of BED's revenues. We've used revenue bonds several times, the electric department has, over the decades, starting in the early 80s to fund the construction of the McNeil generating station. We used them to start up our energy efficiency utility in the early 90s. We used them in 2014 to purchase the Winooski 1 hydro facility, for example. And most recently in 2022, we did what we consider to be the first tranche of borrowing, a $20 million issuance, the first of its kind that we know of in the nation, a net zero energy revenue bond to fund the sorts of investments in our distribution system, our grid, to enable us to move to electrification to achieve net zero for the city.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me so far.
So, what we wanted to start off with as well is kind of how are we doing with the 2022 revenue bond. So we had a $20 million bond that was approved by voters back in December of 2021, and we issued it in April of 2022. And what we've done since then is we've spent a little over $12.5 million, about $12.5 million of the $20 million. And we anticipate that we're going through either the end of this fiscal year or perhaps early in the next fiscal year, spend through that initial tranche for a number of exciting things, including, we talk about electrification, we talk about people wanting to drive electric, use heat pumps, everything from geothermal heating to electric transit buses that we're supporting. We need to make sure that the grid can accommodate those. So part of the current bond is moving the grid from 77 megawatts of capacity up to 80. We peak in the summertime at around 65, so that gives us some headroom, and the new bond would give us more. We'll talk about that. We know reliability is number one priority for Burlington customers every time we survey. So this also is making a number of investments to make sure the grid's reliable. And I think that's particularly important as we're using it for more things. We're using it for transportation, we're using it for heating, not just to turn the lights on in traditional uses. We want to stay reliable. And we've invested in a number of other things here, including our EV charging infrastructure. We had the first modern fast charger in our public network installed as part of this revenue bond. New charging in partnership with our parks at Oak Ledge Park, for example. Beginning to convert our fleet over to electric, and not just for vehicles, but for trucks. So we had the first all-electric bucket truck in the state of Vermont was part of this current revenue bond, and our fleet and our line crew is using that truck around town.
I've seen it.
Yeah, so if you see the orange trucks, typically this one is has a green wrap around it, and it's the 100% electric bucket truck. And we're doing a lot with our technology systems as well to update those so we can have more dynamic rates and help customers who are using EVs and heat pumps save money and reduce their peak impact, as well as some investments in our renewable plants. So that's kind of the status of the current bond, but we anticipate, as I mentioned, by the end of this fiscal year, early next fiscal year, we'll have moved through that. And we had always anticipated this might be a two-tranche approach with $20 million initially and followed by an additional up to $20 million. So our next slide, we talk about what would we use the new funding for. And I mentioned the grid upgrades. We're going from 77 to 80 megawatts currently. This would take us up to 90 megawatts. So this is really investing through the end of the current decade to make sure that the grid remains able to accommodate all of those new electric uses that we want to have that are a key part of our climate strategy in Burlington and the national picture of the climate strategy that's being implemented by the Biden administration and by Congress. Some other exciting pieces here. We're able to draw down against federal grants with these revenue bonds, our match. And so we were successful with two really significant competitive federal grants so far, including a recently announced almost $5 million in federal funds to come to Burlington to support EV charging. And so this slide that we have here is actually already out of date in a good way. We said here we would get 88 new public EV charging stations as part of the bond. Because of the federal grant, if we're able to use the bond and the grant, we're talking about 200 new EV charging stations for Burlington, 47 new fast chargers. Currently we have one in our public network, and then there's one that one of our customers has. So a really significant increase in the fast chargers that make it possible to stop, charge up for 15, 20 minutes, go from 10 or 20% of a battery all the way up to 80 and get back on the road. as well as community chargers for our renters and folks who may not have off-street parking. So that's a really significant investment. There's some other pieces
where those
as
are
well.
going to be, those EV spots, where might those end up?
Yeah, well, we've done a really extensive planning process with our team, but we actually have a survey up on our website. It's a good chance for me to encourage folks to visit burlingtonelectric.com and check out, if you go to our website, we have a charger survey. So we want to hear from the community in terms of, where are places that you feel we would benefit from having charging. The other piece is with the federal grant, and this is something we're very, very supportive of, the Justice 40 provision says we want to invest at least 40% of the funds into communities that are considered federally disadvantaged under climate and economic justice criteria. So for us in Burlington, that's part of the South End and part of downtown and the Old North End meet those criteria. So we know we're going to want to invest significantly in those communities and make sure charging is accessible and equitable in terms of where we're able to plan it throughout the city.
Right. And you mentioned 90 megawatts is where you're hopefully headed. So do you know how much of that is, when you install 200 spots for EV charging, how much of that is actually going to get taken up? How close are we going to get to that peak?
That's a great question. I think the fast chargers in particular can be, if they're all in use together, could be a more particular draw on peak. But the great thing about EV charging is something around 80% of it's happening at home. And not necessarily at the public stations. The public stations are a support system, but a lot of the benefit of charging is if you're able to charge at home or in your parking space overnight, and you have a fresh, essentially a fresh tank, so to speak, with your battery every morning. And when we do that, we can give customers an off-peak rate, and we're actually using energy during times when we're not near that peak. What I think the bigger challenge will be is really with heat pumps. We used to be a winter peaking state and a winter peaking city and a winter peaking region. And more recently, as we moved away from the old electric resistance heat and towards fossil fuel heating around the region, we moved to being a summer peaking city, certainly, and then summer peaking region. I think if we're successful with heat pumps, we're going to go back to being a winter peaking system for good reason, because we're using more efficient technology. We're getting off of fossil fuel. But so when I think about that 90 megawatts, I'm thinking not as much about the EVs. That's going to be a piece of it. But I'm thinking about those heat pump systems, the geothermal systems that are going to be running when it's cold out, and making sure we have capacity to support those. Because unlike with an EV charger where you can maybe interrupt the charging or have off-peak, you can mitigate some of the peak impacts from heat pumps, but you can't, obviously, if you're using them for heating, you're not going to shut them off in the middle of winter. You want to keep them running. So that's a different challenge that we'll be grappling with.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have more questions, but maybe you've got more slides, so I'll...
We do. I'll mention just the last point on this slide is that we're also going to continue our own fleet conversion. So this bond would support 10 new electric vehicles for BED's fleet that we're going to change over, another all-electric bucket truck, and even an electric forklift. So we're really trying to electrify everything that we can, get rid of fossil fuel within our own fleet, and lead by example. And I'm going to turn it back to Emily for the next slide.
Okay, so this shows a breakdown of how the bond proceeds would be invested across those categories, those broad categories that Darren just stepped through. As you can see, the bulk of it, almost 80%, would go toward those distribution system upgrades to increase the capacity of our grid and to increase the availability of public EV charging in the city. About 9% would go toward capital investments in our generation facilities, including the FERC relicensing of the Winooski 1 hydro facility, which is a pretty big deal and happens only every 30 years, I believe, as well as some investments in McNeil to make it more efficient. A wood chip dryer that was required to be in our budget by city council resolution. And it's also time to renew our nitrous oxide emissions system at McNeil. So those are three really key investments in our generation plant. And fleet EVs, as Darren mentioned, at 4%, and then continued investments in our technology systems make up the other 7%.
Do you have a sense of how long it'll take to spend this all down, the $20 million, this next batch of $20 million?
Yeah, so the current bond was issued in the spring of 2022. we're estimating it's going to take us 4 to 5 years. Part of the challenge with spending that bond as quickly as we had thought we might has been the supply chain disruptions that we've seen coming out of the pandemic and then kind of continuing after the pandemic. So for example, we have like over $1 million of transformer orders, for example, that are back ordered, right? So that's kind of the magnitude, and then some of the lead times on some of these large components can be a year. So we certainly will try to spend the bond as quickly as we can, but I also think it will also depend on the sort of capacity of our own workforce to carry out the projects. But I would say within 5 years, based on our experience with the first bond.
Okay. And so I have questions about how this impacts ratepayers and what the rates are going to look like. Maybe is that your next, or am I jumping ahead here?
The exact next
You're
slide
right
we
on
have.
time.
There you go. So
It's our next and last slide.
Okay.
So just what this slide is showing is just that the FY26 projected rate pressure, and we talk about rate pressure, it's not a rate change. It's really kind of an indication at a moment in time of what the upward pressure might be. And we have on here 120 days cash on hand because that's one of the metrics that we track for our credit rating, which we track for Moody's. So this is looking at if you want to fund all the projects we just talked about, and you want to continue to fund the net zero energy initiatives, if you have the revenue bond versus without the revenue bond in fiscal 26. With the revenue bond, we see currently 2% of upward rate pressure, which is very low, certainly kind of tracks with basically with inflation at this point. Without the revenue bond, we would, if we want to do all those things, just in FY26, you'd see almost 13% of upward rate pressure. So we have not had a double-digit rate case during my tenure at BED or really over the last several decades. I think you have to go back to the early 2000s timeframe to look at some of those types of rate cases. We went 12 years without a rate change at all, even as we became 100% renewable. Coming out of the pandemic, we had some challenges, as everyone did, as Emily just mentioned, with supply chain, but also we saw our commercial sales, which are roughly 75% of our sales revenues. Those declined significantly. They're beginning to kind of return to normal levels, what we would consider normal pre-pandemic levels. But so we had a lot of challenges with that.
In the pandemic, why would the pandemic cause less uptake of electricity?
What it did is we had more use on the residential side and less use in the commercial buildings, the offices, some of the institutions, the campuses.
Right.
And for us, at least as a utility, only about 25% of our revenue comes from residential. So while we saw some increase in residential revenue, it was more than offset, unfortunately, on the commercial side. And it put some pressure on our budget such that we had our first rate change. And that rate change was 7.5% back in the 2022 timeframe. Since then, we've been able to keep changes between 3.95 and 5.5%. We're conscious that any rate change is an impact for our customers. At the same time, what we've seen elsewhere with electricity is it's been going up much higher than the rate of inflation. I think I've seen over 7% annually over the last 3 years nationally, the price of electricity. And in some of our neighboring states that are more exposed to the fossil fuel market prices, they've had double or even triple digit rate changes. So while we've had rate changes, they've been much more moderate, and our goal is to keep them moderate, and we're consistently aiming for kind of low or mid single digits, not high single digits, not double digits. So this is an effort here with this bond to make investments, to spread the cost of those investments over a reasonable time frame, and to do so in a way that we believe is fiscally responsible for our customers while still meeting our objectives around reliability and climate.
And on that first bond, the $20 million from 2022, how much of that has been paid back? Is there kind of some rate pressure to come from that kicking in? So what's the timeline there on when folks might expect to pay back some of this through potentially increased rates?
Yeah, so we have started repaying that bond. Those are 20-year bonds as well, so they'll mature in 2041. We have tried to align the debt service schedule for this issuance with the maturity of some of our other existing revenue bonds. So we've we have some, we're still paying back some old bonds, like the 2014 one I mentioned for Winooski 1. That's going to mature this fiscal year, and that's going to drop $684,000 of debt service off the table that will be then available to use toward repayment of this new bond. And then similarly, we have another $1 million of debt service retiring in 2032, and then another $800,000 in 2035. So we will be continuing to pay, back to your question, on the 2022 bond, right, for till 2041, or 2042, I guess. But we also have other bonds maturing, like over that a time period.
Right.
To free up debt service capacity is the idea.
Right. And so with these, a total of $40 million in bonds in the just these two in 2022 and 2024, do you have a sense of what year, like in what year the sort of peak rate pressure might be experienced from these bonds, or what, I mean, should folks expect to see their electric bill steady for a while and then increase 5 years from now? Or, what is the, I'm thinking of like the Burlington High School bond has, it incrementally comes up in terms of what actually has to be paid off each year, and then it comes down, but it's up pretty high for a while. So is there a certain, what might we expect, what might ratepayers expect in terms of when an increase might kick in from this, if it would?
I think it's important just to note that the rate pressure that we've been seeing is not primarily related to the bonds, but it's really related to some other pieces. One of them is regional transmission costs. We have to pay a certain amount each year to be connected to the regional grid, be part of the state grid. Those costs have been going up, and those are uncontrolled costs we have to pay to be part of the grid. Every utility does. So we're seeing those costs as a significant driver, as well as, over the last couple of years, we saw the inflation being a significant driver. Labor costs were significantly higher than they had been, some other things. But the thing here that's interesting, and maybe makes it maybe not quite analogous to something like the high school bond, is, as Emily was mentioning, we have some existing debt service that's scheduled to come off at particular intervals, and we've structured the repayment on the 22 bond and would structure the repayment on this new bond as well, in a way that there isn't such a peak as you're describing, but more of a flat trajectory in terms of the debt service. So while we will be repaying it, and it certainly does come from revenues, it's not necessarily going to be a kind of spike at a particular time, or necessarily driving increases at a particular time. It should be kind of a continued steady repayment process. And obviously when we go to look at issuing bonds, we look at that because that's one of the metrics that we also track. It's called the debt ratio, in terms of how much debt do you have versus your assets and different things like that.
Right. Something that we've heard from constituents and also from legislators, as we've had folks in this year to come in for candidate forums, is an interest in the long term reducing reliance on on burning wood chips and the current operations of the McNeil plant. So what would the investments from this bond, what parts of this bond are intended to support operations in McNeil, and does this bond impact the long-term outlook of Burlington's reliance on burning wood chips?
So really, the bond is mostly not related to McNeil. As the prior slide showed that Emily mentioned, 80% is really focused on the grid and EV charging. Only about 9% of the bond's on generation, and even of that, most of it's related to Winooski 1, relicensing as well. So there's only two pieces of the bond that relate to McNeil. One is investing in a wood chip dryer, which essentially you can gain efficiency if the wood chips that you're using have less moisture content. And so the wood chip dryer is an efficiency measure, and potentially we can dry those wood chips using waste heat from the facility. So there's a nice nexus there in terms of improving the environmental footprint. And then we made an investment with the joint owners of that facility back in 2008, a $12 million investment to reduce air emissions, including NOx emissions, to levels that are well below state and federal requirements. So we have a replacement of that system, the NOx catalyst. Those are the only two items related to McNeil. Neither of them affect the kind of lifespan or trajectory of how we are looking at the plant. And we have some separate efforts not related to the bond, two RFPs that are out right now that were just approved at City Council that are aimed at helping us look at, in addition to the wood chip dryer, what other efficiency measures can we support with McNeil? How can we use the site in an innovative way? We're looking at things like battery storage. We actually are hosting a hydroponic agriculture site at the McNeil plant right now. We have a shipping container that's doing indoor agriculture in support of Intervale farms that were displaced during the flooding. So there's a lot of innovative ways you can use the site. We have a solar research center with UVM at the site as well. And then how can we reduce the emissions? Because we have managed forestry in Vermont, and McNeil plays some role in that, but how can we reduce the stack emissions from the facility? And we're looking at ways to do that as well. So the mayor talks about it as being a near, medium, and long-term just transition, and that's something that we're committed to. And so these investments that are in the bond are in support of that effort.
Got just a few minutes left here. In terms of so you'll be taking this show on the road, I hear. You're going to be going to the MPAs to talk about this as well.
That's right.
What have you heard? I think you said you've only done one presentation at an MPA thus far, but what did you hear from folks at that MPA presentation?
Yeah. We were at Ward 8, and we'll be at all of the MPAs during October, so we look forward to hearing from Burlington residents about what their thoughts are. I think we did get a couple questions about McNeil, similar to kind of the question that you just asked at the Ward 8 forum.
We got some questions about interest rates, which were good questions, and so we can talk a little bit about that. So the ballot question, if approved, gives the city authorization to issue on behalf of BED these bonds, but it doesn't specify when or in what amount. So we would have the flexibility to time the issuance, and so certainly we'll be watching the interest rate environment closely. The Fed just cut rates 0.5%. Future cuts are forecast, right? So we will, of course, be watching those rates and trying to issue when we think they're low, maybe as low as they can get, or at much or lower than they are now, certainly a more favorable rate environment.
Yeah, we were fortunate that the 22 bond was issued in April prior to interest rates rising the way that they did. And now we're fortunate in a way that we potentially, if this is approved, can issue when rates are back on a downward trajectory, and we'll have avoided issuing debt during that higher interest rate time period.
Well, in setting up this forum, we didn't find anyone who was yelling and hollering against this bond question, which is good news for you guys. But if this does fail, I mean, you put on the screen there that's without this bond to make the same investments would cause a lot of rate pressure. What would the BED's course of action? Would you go back to the voters next year to try and get something similar, or would you try to make it work? Like what would be the recourse if this goes down?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been really fortunate to have support from Burlingtonians for a variety of investments over the years. And one of the things I really value about our community and our commitment on climate is that we've been willing, whether it's on policy, such as the carbon fee votes, or whether it's on investments, we've been willing to kind of move forward in a way and lead the way. The first net zero revenue bond was first of its kind for any public power utility in the country. So that said, to answer your question, if we didn't have the bond to move forward, we would face some difficult choices. We would either have to scale back our investment in some of these climate initiatives that we'd like to move forward, and some of the reliability initiatives we'd like to move forward, and or face higher near-term rate pressure, or probably some combination of both, which doesn't, for us, seem like a good fiscal outcome or a good outcome relative to our climate progress. So that's the kind of difficult choices we'd have to make as a public utility, as community utility, with our governing bodies if this wasn't able to move forward.
Got it. Well, thank you both very much for joining us, Darren Springer and Emily Stebbins-Wheelock. Really appreciate your time today. And thank you for tuning into Town Meeting TV's coverage of the 2024 election. You can find this program and many more online at cctv.org/general. Thanks so much. So long.